Hi, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox. We're talking about the 1920s. And in previous videos, we've touched on how going into the 1920s following World War I, Americans were promised a return to normalcy. But that just doesn't happen. In fact, during the 1920s, America is redefining herself, both in the world and here at home. The 1920s are going to introduce us to a cultural change that is going to be a complete upheaval of everything we've known up to this point. In this video, we're going to continue talking about the American culture, except this time we're going to talk about day-to-day life in America. We'll look at the effects of such things as Prohibition, or the debate between modernist and fundamentalist. We're going to see revolutions in areas such as entertainment and transportation. Americans are going to become consumers, and in doing that, we'll have mass consumption. And then finally, the rise of women and how their roles are going to change in society forever. So, without further ado, let's start looking at the culture of the 1920s. Coming out of the Industrial Revolution of the early 1900s, Americans found new ways to manufacture their goods. Ford's manufacturing model is going to expand to other industries, and what this is going to allow for is affordable consumer goods that will be readily available for the American people. On top of that, electricity is expanding to people's homes, and with that, the demand for consumer appliances to make their day-to-day lives easier. Can't afford to buy any of these new goods? Don't worry, because credit is going to be introduced to the Americans, the installment plan in which you can buy today but pay tomorrow. And all of this is going to be spurred on by advertising. Marketing is going to become a brand new industry, and Americans are going to be flooded with a rash of advertisements telling them about all the new goods that are being created to make their lives that much easier. Transportation is going to add on to this mass consumerism. Frederick Taylor's scientific management program. This was an idea that if you optimize and simplify jobs, you're going to increase production. Well, that's just going to add to the consumer products that are going to be flooding the market. This principle is going to lead to lower costs, and more of these new goods are going to become more affordable to everyday Americans. For instance, the automobile is going to become affordable to the average American. It's not just going to be a luxury item anymore. The spur of the transportation revolution is going to lead to more industries growing. Everything tied to the automobile, that industry is going to explode. Car tires, engines, oil, you name it, and it's going to happen. It will be necessary to add more infrastructure to city planning, to build more roads and bridges to accommodate these new automobiles that are hitting the road. On top of the automobile, air travel is going to take off. The Wright brothers had introduced air flight in the early century, and during World War I, we saw the use of airplanes as a weapon. Well, now that industry is growing, and one person who is responsible for its growth is Charles Lindbergh, who will be the first man to successfully fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. He's going to become a national hero overnight due to that trip. And talk about national heroes. The entertainment revolution is also going to take off during this time period. We're going to enter into a mass media period where radio and movies are going to become the center of American entertainment. November of 1920 marks the very first time a radio broadcasted political results with the election of Harding. And that same idea is going to transform politicians and how they campaign moving forward. The radio actually brings Americans closer together. Every night we can sit around as a family and tune into some of the famous shows like Dark Shadows or The Lone Ranger, and we can share these stories when we go out into the public and talk about what we heard on the radio last night. On top of that, the movie industry is growing. In 1927, the very first talking movie is going to be played called The Jazz Singer. And it's just going to explode from there. Leisure time is going to introduce all sorts of new entertainment for Americans, like the radio and movies and sports. Athletes like Babe Ruth are going to become a household name. In fact, we're going to see the rise of an American celebrity culture thanks to the entertainment revolution. During the 1920s, something fantastic happened for the roles of gender in society. Half of the American population was living in urban areas, and women have become part of the workforce. If you remember, in World War I, they actually took on some of the jobs that men left so they could go fight in the war. Now that the war is over, more jobs are opening up to them in clerical, nursing, and teaching roles. They also are hired for the minimal skilled jobs. Now, let's be honest, they get paid half as much as everybody else, but progress is being made. A new style is going to come out during the 1920s called the flappers, and this is going to personify the independent woman in the urban 1920s. We're going to see everything getting shorter from hair to skirts. My gosh, they're showing their ankles. On top of that, women will start to take more ownership of their sexuality. Margaret Sanger is going to advocate for birth control during this time. Now, to be honest, she is getting involved in eugenics, where birth control was to be used on African American women in poor societies. Margaret Sanger's ideas are not going to be embraced here in America, and she will end up going over to London, where she will start Planned Parenthood. And when we talk about African Americans, we have to talk about the Great Migration. Now, this actually started during World War I, as African Americans started migrating to the North for jobs with the war effort. This is almost a continuation of the exodusters, those folks who left the South to move west in order to build a new life away from the southern states. Some of the pull factors that were bringing African Americans to the North included new opportunity for employment and new opportunity for education. But there were also factors that were pushing them out of the South, and that included injustice. They wanted to escape the fact that they couldn't receive a fair trial in the South, and also the continuation of lynching and the terrorist organizations such as the KKK. As they move north, they're going to bring their culture north with them, specifically their music. New Orleans jazz is going to move north with the Great Migration. This migration is also going to spur what's known as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem in New York City became the culture center of Black America. And what we're going to see during the 1920s is a revival of arts and intellectual pursuits of this migrating Black population. New literature is going to be introduced by such authors as Langston Hughes, who promoted equality, condemned racism, and celebrated the Black culture. And as I mentioned before, music is going to become part of the African American culture, which will spread to all of America. People like Louis Armstrong is going to bridge that musical gap between African Americans and the rest of the country during the 1920s. Another idea is going to come up during this time, the United Negro Improvement Association. You see, not everyone bought into the fact that African Americans would be successful here in America. Marcus Garvey is going to found the UNIA, and what he's going to do is call for African Americans to go back to Africa, a form of separatism. He is going to create the Black Star Line, in which he will offer passage to African Americans to actually go back to Africa. He's going to promote Black pride, and he's also going to promote Black-owned businesses. However, he is still pushing for that separatism idea. Because of that, W.E.B. Du Bois is actually going to call him the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race. There were absolutely some different opinions going on as to what would be best for the African American during this time period. But make no mistake about it, they are making a huge cultural impact on America at this point that will continue until today. There are going to be challenges to the fundamental ideas that were uniquely American during the last 150 years. There's going to be a battle between the values that are developing in these modern cities versus the traditional values of rural America. And a lot of this is going to spur from the fundamentalist idea of the inerrant view of the Bible, that the Bible should be taken literally. Now, people like Billy Sunday, a famous radio personality, is going to go on and preach nationwide against drinking, dancing, jazz, and gambling, and that's the whole life in the cities at this point. But when it really comes to a head is in Tennessee in the mid-1920s, when the ACLU is going to start working to change laws that prevented the teaching of Darwinism. They are going to enlist a substitute teacher by the name of John Scopes, who will go into a Tennessee school and actually teach Darwinism to his students. Now, that was against the law in Tennessee, so he will be arrested. And what is known as the Scopes monkey trial is going to take place in Tennessee, bringing some of the biggest names in the legal world to Tennessee. Clarence Darrow will represent the defense, defending John Scopes, and on the other side, William Jennings Bryan will be representing the fundamentalist view, taking on the prosecution of John Scopes. The trial was followed daily on the radio, and in the end, John Scopes will be found guilty of a misdemeanor and fined $100. However, this trial is more about demonstrating the tension that was increasing between the modern and traditional religious values in the 1920s. The biggest event that everyone thinks about when they think about the 1920s is Prohibition. In 1919, the 18th Amendment is going to be ratified. Prohibition has been fought for since the mid-1800s during the first reform movement and the temperance movement, and finally it has come to pass. And the 18th Amendment is going to prohibit the manufacture and sale of alcohol in the United States of America. The Volstead Act will be passed, and this is the federal law that gave the government the authority to enforce the amendment. There's going to be a lot of opposition to this amendment, especially in the cities. This ties to that debate between the fundamentalists and modern debate that was going on throughout our entire country. As a result of Prohibition, alcohol doesn't go away. We just find new ways to obtain it. And the ways we're doing that is through bootleg liquor and speakeasies. Bootleg liquor is liquor that has been smuggled into the country, specifically by members of an organized crime unit. The mafia is going to rise during the 1920s, and people such as Al Capone and Lucky Luciano are going to take advantage of the high demand for alcohol to help build their crime family, not only in New York and Chicago, but cities throughout the country. Law enforcement is going to have a very difficult time enforcing these laws, primarily because, number one, they're understaffed, or number two, they're corrupt and they just let it happen under their nose. Needless to say, Prohibition is going to prove to be a failure. And when FDR comes into office in 1933, the 18th Amendment will be repealed with the 21st Amendment. Finally, the 1920s is going to introduce us to the lost generation. This is a rising class of intellectuals who condemned life in America during the 20s. They looked at this new industrial society and the materialism that was taking over, and they saw that as a challenge to America. They started to criticize different parts of our society, going back to why did we even fight in World War I? What was really gained from that? They challenged small-town values along with the fundamentalist religious views. But they also challenged materialism and the rise of mass consumption during this period. Some of the most famous authors that came out of the Lost Generation: F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and maybe you're familiar with some of the titles that came out of this time period, such as The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, or Gone with the Wind. The 1920s were supposed to get us back to normal. But in the end, what we're going to find is that we have, as a culture and as a society, redefined what America is. It's referred to as the Roaring '20s, and I'm not sure if the roar was coming from the political decisions we were making or the social changes we were making. But make no mistake about it, the America in 1929 is completely different than the America we lived in 1919. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. If you missed anything, you can always go back and watch again. Give me a like if you enjoyed any of this, and subscribe. But other than that, I thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.